Greetings and bienvenue, MITZU. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
OK/X/gather around. I've got some nice family OC for you, mainly involving black magic, voodoo, things of that nature. When I'm done with the story, let's turn this into a general creepy family stories nope thread. This is my first time sharing a story like this, so forgive me if I'm a horrible storyteller. Still have some chills just from the general creepiness paranormal activity that went on in the story. I heard this story because my mom was telling it to her nephew, my cousin who lives with me, because it was something that she thought he needed to know. I will begin with a backstory, and if there's interest in the thread, I will continue. My cousin is 25 years old, and his mom, my mother's sister, was murdered by his father when he was 7. He has 2 other siblings, but they are irrelevant to the story. My aunt was murdered the night of October 25th, 1995. Although the father was both physically and verbally abusive to her and the family, he was a decent man, would never go far enough to kill, or so we thought. Unfortunately, my aunt was very gullible, forgiving, afraid, and was a victim of domestic violence, so she would continuously forgive him and try to keep this all a secret. On the night of October 25th, 1995, my cousin's father pulled out a gun and shot his mother in front of his eyes. He basically held his bleeding mother in his hands until police were called. His father was found outside smoking a cigarette, very calm and not disturbed. In court, he was denying everything and was acting very eerie and strange. He had no history of any mental disorders. He even went far enough to blame his eldest son for the murder. When my mom had a chance to speak and ask him why, he just stayed quiet with a smile on his face. The trial went on and he was sentenced 25 to life and is currently in prison. I come from a Christian Armenian family. As my mom was typing up some stuff for court, basically against her brother-in-law, she said she felt her sister's presence in the room. The typewriter was going nuts. Candles were being blown out. Things in the room were moving, etc. My mom explains it as if she was trying to prevent me from writing it up, as if she wanted me to forgive him. My mom had a weird moment where she just spoke very sternly and in tears, and said something along the lines of, "Anon, this has to be done. He cannot be forgiven, and you need to let go and find peace." After this was said, everything stopped being all weird, went back to normal, and my mom said there was a strange feeling of relief and peace in the room. Her 18th year of passing was a couple of days ago, and my mom shared a very chilling story with my cousin. Here it is in the words of my mother. "Sometime after the murder of your mother, something just felt weird. I had a lot of unanswered questions, and there was just a strange, uncomfortable, evil feeling around. So a friend of mine introduced me to a medium/psychic/witch. She didn't really specify here, but it's a woman who specializes in magic. This woman did not know my mother, and my mother did not know her. The friend who introduced my mother to this lady did not know anything about the murder of my mother's sister, and was not told anything about it. As I walked into her office, I did not say anything to her. She began to talk. She began by telling me that something tragic has happened recently. She told me that I was one of 3 children in my family. My mom also has a brother. She told me that one of us is no longer here. She told me that I was born the same month as my sister, August, and her date came first and my date came second. This is true, my aunt's is on the 7th and my mother's is on the 15th. As we began to talk, she told me that there is a curse that was placed on my mother, our grandma. She asked if my parents still live in the house where we all lived together. I told her that they had recently moved to a smaller place. She asked me to take her to the house where the family as a whole lived together. I was already overwhelmed about the whole curse thing, and this lady started to really creep me out because she was telling me all these things about me and the family. My mom was creeped out because as a Christian, she really doesn't believe in things of this nature, but was so overwhelmed by it. She told me that the curse would be found at this house. She said this was where it was planted. As we approached the street where the house was, without giving her a hint, a clue, or the address, she pointed to the house. As we got out of the car, I told her the house no longer belongs to us, and I don't have a key to the inside. She said, She didn't need the key. She said that it was planted outside the house. She began to scope out the area and stopped at a certain spot in the front yard. Nothing was out of the ordinary or weird. There was a patch of grass and flowers over this spot, so I know she didn't call anyone to come place something here as part of a scheme. She handed me a little shovel and told me that she wanted me to dig but not to touch anything. I skeptically began to dig, and soon enough I saw something. First was a blue bead/ball/round object. Connect your pointer finger and thumb together to make an O, and she described the size like that. She has normal hands for a woman. If anyone into magic/occult/witchcraft knows what this could be, please feel free to tell me. Then there was something else wrapped up. She continuously stressed me not to touch these objects. She picked up both of these objects and we went back to her office. She said this curse was placed on my mother and for all of her children to die. The first object, the blue ball thing, was for my brother. When she unwrapped the other object, it was 2 keys with nails or pins all over and through them, and they were wrapped together with a metal-ish wire. This was for the 2 girls, me and my sister. She began to have a puzzled look on her face and got lost in deep thought. She began to tell me that she can put an end to this curse, but has some questions for me. She told me that it was a miracle that I was alive, and that I should have been dead, but she said someone died in my place. I had no idea what she was talking about or who she was referring to. She said, "You and your sister were born in the same month you're later, and she's earlier. Who is a female in your family with the birthday in between your 2 dates? There is a female who is no longer here who has a birthday in between your 2 dates." I came to realize and freaked out and told her that my aunt's birthday is August 9th. She told me that she is no longer here, right? She was right, my aunt died 4 years after your mother. Somehow my aunt had been affected by the curse instead of me. I obviously asked her who was doing this and why. She said that this was done out of pure hate and jealousy. She said this was done by someone who was a member of my mother's family. She said she will not tell me the name of who did it, but she told me that my clue of finding out who it was that because the curse was stopped and the negative energy was released back, that their life would take a turn for the worse. I thanked her and never spoke or saw this lady again. My aunt, my mom's sister-in-law, always hated my mom and was always jealous of the life she had. Within the past few years, her life began to take a turn for the worse. One of her children divorced his wife and is now on his 4th marriage and is an alcoholic and cannot live a normal life. One of her other kids fell into drugs and overdosed. Another one of her kids is a criminal drug addict that is in and out of prison. She has diabetes, had to have one of her legs amputated, and has all sorts of health problems. She is also hated by her husband, children, and barely has anyone looking out for her. She is living in misery. I know this is not bull because the subject of my aunt's murder is very sensitive to my family. I cannot imagine my mom making this up and telling it to my cousin for no apparent reason. My mom was always skeptical about these things due to her religion, but now is blown away by it. She is not the type of woman to make things up, especially when she is trying to have a sincere conversation with her niece, which she basically takes care of as her son. If anyone has any insight or knowledge on the objects or the curses or spells that were used for this, please let me know. I just find it so crazy and scary that such evil power magic exists in this world and in some people. Anyone else have stories that are similar? I have a couple of more that I've heard from my girlfriend's family. They come from a Romanian village in Transylvania and have told me some stories about witches and demons. I will share a little bit. OP here. I will begin the story that was told by my girlfriend's parents. My girlfriend and her family are from a village in Transylvania, Romania. In their village, you are expected to be welcoming with other villagers. There was this old, oddly crippled, handicapped lady who lived right by their house. Everyone in the village knew she was strange and, translating from Romanian to English is different, but was labeled the living dead woman. My girlfriend's family is also Christian, and her mom began to tell me stories of when the lady would invite herself over for some tea or food. My girlfriend's mom was known in the village to cook good food, so that probably explains why the old lady would always come over. My girlfriend's mom told me that she wouldn't really talk, was very vague and blunt, and would just look around and sometimes even stare blankly at them. She would always stay standing and they would always offer her a seat, but she would almost always refuse. If she didn't refuse, she would leave the chair over her head, recite some sort of chant in a language that they did not understand, and then sit on it. Most of the time, my girlfriend's mom would just pack her food and goodies and try to send her on her way because she was super creeped out by her. The old lady would open up what she gave, take a couple of bites of the food, sometimes none at all, leave everything there, and would leave. They would always throw out utensils, cups, and plates that she used in their house because that's how bad of vibes she gave off. There were always rumors about her being a witch in the village, and children would always often make tales about her and avoid her. My girlfriend vouches for most of these things. Although she was a young child, she remembers most of it. Again, I highly doubt my girlfriend's family is trying to pull my leg. Her dad is a very old-fashioned village dude, super militant and credible, and hardly likes to joke around. Anyway, a couple of her grandchildren lived with her. Where are the parents, you may ask? Well, here's where it gets fun. She had one daughter who married a man that she did not like. The family was very happy, loving, and normal. One day, the wife and children walked into their home and found him hanging from the living room ceiling. The daughter made a scene in the village about this being the work of her mother and went mad. Left her children behind, and no one really knows what happened to her. The children were infants when this happened, so they don't have any memory of it, and for obvious reasons, no one in the village tells these young children what really happened to their parents. One day, around sunset, as my girlfriend's father was finishing work around his farm, he noticed some of the grandchildren running around and playing. He called to them and told them that it's getting dark and to run on home. One of them turned to him and said, "Tonight is a special night. They don't like to be home because they are scared that they will disturb their grandmother." My girlfriend's dad, obviously confused and curious, asked them what they were talking about. Quick backstory. Village woman in Romania during this time, and I'm sure now too, wore some sort of headband that covered their hair. I'm sure you can picture some old grandma with some headband thingy. I was told younger girls had colorful ones, and old women usually had black ones. Anyway, back to the story. The children told my girlfriend's father that tonight is the night that her horns come out. Follow us, we will show you. My girlfriend's dad was obviously WTFing all over the place and wanting to know what these silly kids were talking about. Finished up what he had to do and met with them later on. By this time, it was dark already and there was a full moon out. I know it sounds cliché, but bear with me. As they approached the backyard, he said he heard weird chanting, singing. They peeped through a broken wood in the fence, and my girlfriend's dad saw this lady taking off her headband, and I shit you not, told me that she had 2 horns growing out of her head. Not like ridiculous, sharp, crazy, huge horns, but 2 horns kind of dull at the tips growing out of her head as she was chanting to the moon. The kids got excited and basically said, see, we told you." And my girlfriend's dad stared at this in awe, and after a few moments told them to run to the other neighbor's home, not wanting them at his home so she can come get them later. And he ran home and told his wife. He ran home and told his wife about this, and she is a huge skeptic and basically laughed at him and told him to stop drinking. He's not an alcoholic, but is a famous musician, so he's often partying and drinking and stuff. He swore up and down, and by the time he could convince her to go, the lady was no longer in the back and already inside the house. This obviously did not help his wife believe him. So flash forward to the next full moon that he sees, he grabs her and they go to peep at the neighbor. She is not chanting this time, but is on her knees in a black gown, staring up at the moon, and behold, there are horns on her head. Her mother started getting goosebumps and swearing to me up and down she knew what she saw. And it's not like they were children, they are adults, and they stood her and watched this. They didn't just get a peep and run away. To make this even more credible, he brought 2 of his music buddies on 2 separate occasions to show them, and they all saw it. So my girlfriend's dad witnessed this 4 times. He told me how he would continuously examine her head during the day, and said she would always wear her hair down, and that the headband was always flat, no horns, no bumps. Her head was perfectly normal in the day. He also would go check on her during other nights to see if she would do these weird rituals, but it was only when there was a full moon that it was out. From this point on, they did their best to stay as far away from this woman as possible, even to the point where they would not walk on the same side of the street as her, and would just not answer the door when she knocked. She eventually stopped trying. By the way, from what I can tell, she was not a gypsy. Her parents would have specified to me if she was or not, because they have a strong dislike for gypsies, and would have thrown it in there if she was. A few years later, they attended a village party, and she was there. It was kind of a potluck thing, and everyone would bring food, drinks, gifts, etc. My girlfriend's parents kept their kids close and kept an eye on her, and told her kids not to take or eat anything that she tried to give them. My girlfriend's parents said that she brought a bunch of shot glasses filled with a drink called balinka. It's like a Romanian moonshine, and everyone basically loves it and goes insane for it there. Before she started offering it to people, they said she pulled out this little container bottle thingy, sucked out of it, and blew all over these shot glasses. My girlfriend's parents were the only ones who saw this, and my girlfriend's dad pulled on of his friends quickly and warned him not to touch that balinka. The people who got to it didn't see anything and didn't really give a care that it was her because hell yeah, balinka, and started taking shots. That following week, a lot of people from the village were bedridden and extremely sick. No deaths though, but still completely crazy. That's it as far as personal stories from the parents go, but she eventually died. She was like 100+ years old though, and her house, her body, and all her belongings were burned down by the village. It was said that there was a room where she kept all her strange things, and strange books written in unknown languages were found there. Unmarked bottles with unknown liquids and substances, unknown symbols, jars filled with blood, not sure if animal or human, and different jars filled with different animal body parts. The kids were orphaned somewhere 2 cities over, and no one really heard anything after that. But people were pretty sure that she was a witch of some sort. Contorted body, horns, hung son-in-law, weird behavior, weirder things found in home. Nope. Screw that. GIF. I'm supposed to go to Romania and their village with my girlfriend and her family this spring. Apparently there's this haunted forest there, and it's my goal to explore the shit out of it. I'm sure I can find out all sorts of creepy tales from these old villagers. Transylvania is a scary place. Gypsies, witches, vampires, all sorts of shit.
Sup/x/. Ever heard about a place deep in the Catalan Pyrenees called Tor? It has quite a history. The tiny village of Tor lays on the Catalan side of the mountains, and it is one of the most isolated places in the country, only accessible through a long dirt track from Alans, which in turn is connected to Livorsi via a narrow 1-lane country road through a deep gorge. It is cut off the rest of the world by snow most of the winter. At the end of the 1800s, 13 families lived there, and in 1896, they signed a document establishing a community of co-owners of the mountain where the village is located, which extends to the border with Andorra. It was this strategic location that would prove to be a curse to its inhabitants. During the 40s, the isolated location of the village made it a good place for Maquis, Spanish Republican guerrilla fighters, to hide, and in 1944, a confrontation between some Maquis and the Guardia Civil, Spanish police, ended up with 3 houses being burned down. It seems that there were some accusations in the village as to who had tipped the police of the presence of Maquis and who was harboring them, and this was the beginning of a long-standing feud between 2 families that was fueled over decades by isolation and ambition. The 3 families whose houses had been destroyed left the village, and the harsh winter and living conditions, there was no electricity, telephone, or running water, led to a small exodus over the decades, which meant that by the 70s there were few people who still lived in the town all year round. The document that established the co-ownership of the mountain stated that the inhabitants of the village were those in whose houses there was a fire in the hearth all year round, which meant that the few people left in the village regarded themselves as the only legitimate owners. By this time, 2 men, Josep Montaigne, Sansa, and Jordi Riba, El Palenca, were in bitter confrontation over the use of the mountain. Both of them had built dirt roads up the mountain to connect with Andorra, and they were making a big profit with smuggling. There was, and still is, only one road connecting Andorra to Catalonia, which meant smugglers had to resort to walking across the mountains or using mules, so having a dirt road on which 4x4 trucks could drive was of great benefit to them. Sansa and El Palenca blocked and controlled access to their roads and demanded money, goods, or vehicles in exchange. Their feud continued, and the fight over ownership of the mountain and the isolation they lived in made them grow paranoid of each other. Both to protect themselves and to make sure that their properties were always occupied, and thus securing ownership under the provisions of the ancient law, they surrounded themselves with shady characters that had found in the village a way to escape their past. Sansa set up a kind of hippie camp on his land, and El Palanca hired 2 men as bodyguards. By the end of the decade, Sansa, seeing the development of tourism on the other side of the border and having been repeatedly and insistently contacted by several developers, had grown more ambitious and started envisioning building a winter resort in the mountain. Sansa was contacted by an Andorran lawyer and developer with a background in doubtful activities, brothels, strip clubs, smuggling, who put him in touch with British investors and convinced him and 3 other of the original owners to sign a 99-year lease on the mountain. The rest of the co-owners, and especially El Palanca, who wanted to protect his interests in the mountain, were fiercely opposed to the project, and the situation degenerated quickly. The project stalled for a while, as the investors were wary of the community of co-owners and wanted to clarify the legal situation of the land, and at some point during this time, the paved road was built from the Andorran side to the border, probably with hopes that the winter resort would be built, and making the smugglers' life easier. The situation had grown so tense that when the lawyer visited Tor to arrange paperwork with Sansa, he too was accompanied by bodyguards, a couple of retired policemen. It was during one of those visits when they ran into El Palanca and his 2 men, and a heated argument started. Both parties carried guns, and in the confrontation that ensued, the 2 ex-policemen shot the 2 bodyguards dead. They were later arrested and sentenced to 8 years in prison. At the beginning of the 80s, the remaining inhabitants started a legal battle for the ownership of the mountain that dragged on for years, putting off the potential investors and an end to the winter resort project. El Palanca and Sansa continued extorting money from the smugglers until 1995, when the court made a decision and awarded ownership of the mountain to Sansa, on the basis that he was the only real all-year resident in the village. His victory was short-lived, though. 5 months later he was found dead in his house. At first, fingers pointed to the hippies he put up in his Camp Sansa, but shortly after an eyewitness, Antonio Gil, accused Josep Mont and Merli Pinto, a pair of smugglers to whom Sansa allegedly owed money. They were arrested, but later on the judge dismissed Gil's account on the basis that he had psychological problems and there were several contradictions in his declaration. Mont and Pinto walked free and the case is still unsolved today. For anyone interested in going near the mountain, you can find signs like these that translates into private property and road. Mountain of Tor. The owners of the Mountain of Tor will not be held responsible for any physical or material damage occurring to those that enter the property or use the road.
My dad lived out on a farm in Mexico when he was really young. A really old guy owned a plot of land next to his. Old guy lived alone. Didn't have any close family apparently. Old guy really likes my dad. They talked all the time. Old guy thinks my dad is a really pure person. Old guy starts getting sick one day. Old guy really trusts my dad more than anyone else. Tells my dad about a huge sum of money under a stone fence at a very specific spot. Old guy tells my dad to not tell anyone else whatsoever. Few days have passed. Dad decides to check out the spot. Not too far away from home. He goes out to see it. It's getting dark and it's already extremely overcast. Dad can barely see anything. As soon as Dad arrives, he sees something on the ground. It's the head of a woman. Dad gets scared and looks straight ahead. Despite the darkness, he makes out what's standing in front of him instantly. It's the corpse of the head standing straight up facing him. Dad is scared. Corpse lifts its arms and throws something at him. Dad turns around and runs away. He hears a rain of metal objects hit the ground. Dad doesn't look back and just runs back home. He makes it back and refuses to speak with anyone. Later he goes to sleep and dreams about that same spot. He dreams that he was looking at it from a different angle and that this ball of light was hovering over it. He wakes up. He manages to not think much of it. He never saw anything like that after. Years passed and the old man died but sold his land to some folks who really wanted to buy it beforehand. My dad decides to leave Mexico and hop the border into America. In before, her typical Mexican. Gets residency. His mom and brother came with him. Lives here for several years. Years pass again and my grandma begins to miss the farm. This was a few years ago. She gets really depressed about this. She can't control herself because of it. Dad and uncle contacted the family back in Mexico. They say they are willing to take care of her. Dad goes through the whole immigration process. Dad and Uncle set off to take Grandma back home. It was the first time that they went back in 33 years. While their dad goes and finds that same spot from decades ago. He remembers it so clearly. He finds it with not much effort. He begins to shuffle around the dirt a bit where he stood that one evening. He spots something sticking out of the ground. It's a really old coin. He looks around and begins to find a few more. He goes back to the house with the family and finally tells them about everything. Dad leaves and returns to the States. A year later, my dad goes back to visit the family again with my uncle. For the sake of the story, let's call my Uncle A. Dad and arrive and they meet up with my other uncle who lives there. Let's call him G. So my dad and my uncles decide to head out to the nearby town to get some beers. Uncle G takes them to one of his favorite bars. They enter and see their cousin who they hate. Let's call him C. Flashback to late 90s, very early 2000s. C came to the US after my dad and uncle, but unlike them, he never got citizenship or even residency. While he was here, my dad hated C because he would always just ask for money and use it to buy beers and cheap women. He never even got a job. My dad swore he would kill him if he ever touched me or my mom. Dad got so sick of him that he got him wasted, took him to Main Street and just dropped him off. His plan was to leave C there drunk so that he could do something that would get him arrested and therefore deported. It worked. C never came back and he's been stuck in Mexico since. Anyway, back on track. C starts to tell them that he heard of a hidden treasure by the Stone Gate. Dad knows instantly that someone told. Must have been one of the younger kids that were there when Dad told them about it. But what got him was that he said that when he went to look for it and he saw something from a distance. A bright ball of fire that hurts my eyes to look at. He said that the closer he got, the more the pain increased. He couldn't get any closer because it just felt like he was on fire at that point. He had to leave by force. The next night he wants to try again. He doesn't see anything until he gets right on top of the spot. He said that he saw several extremely pale and ridiculously thin people just appear, and that again he gets a feeling of being set on fire. He still didn't want to leave until the people started throwing burning hot rocks on top of him. Again he fled and didn't return. A few days later, my dad is looking through the same spot and finds another coin sticking out of the ground before he left. It looked like one in pick. My dad was determined to find that stash before anyone else did. Next year he returned with a metal detector. Takes it to the same site. The thing loses it. It starts picking shit up all over the place. He remembers the woman that threw all that metal at him as a kid. He starts moving through where he thought it landed. He was moving through the path he ran all those years ago, and again the thing was picking shit up all over the place. He only had 3 days to stay at that time, so he didn't have to actually look for anything, but still left the metal detector there for his family. Before he left, he was still told of how so many other farmers go out to find stashes of gold on property that's not theirs, only to die upon finding it. Exact causes of death vary, but the idea of it stuck to him. He thought that only he and his family were meant to find that money, seeing as how it was basically given to them. He was given it because the old guy liked him so much. A person like my dad's cousin would have driven that old guy into the ground by the way he acted. He was warded off because that man wouldn't want someone else other than my dad to find that money, especially him. I guess the treasures that these people find actually do carry curses within them.
I've got a haunted house story I heard from my dad. It's short and not all that crazy, but it stuck with me because my dad doesn't believe in ghosts, but still tells this story and admits he can't really explain it. 3 or 4 miles from where my dad grew, there's a very old farmhouse that has been abandoned since before he was born. His aunt told him when he was a kid that when the last of the family that lived in that farmhouse died, there was an auction held on the property to get rid of all the shit sitting around that the relatives didn't want. During this sale, his aunt and several other people claimed to see strange gray figures moving around through the windows of the house. Dad doesn't believe her. When he's in his teens, he rides a bike to the house with a friend and they start digging around for loot. While they're on the main floor, they hear a crash upstairs, followed immediately by heavy footsteps running down the stairs. They can see the entire staircase from where they are, and there's nothing on it. They both book it out of the house and ride out of there. I was raised in the same area, and last time I checked the house was still standing. I've been in the yard, but didn't actually go into the house because of how rotted the floor had become and how much of a coward I am.
Vacnalic Opus. I don't have much to tell, but considering this Mediterranean spin, I will tell you all a story of when my mother was abducted by gypsies. My grandparents were bohemian types, apparently. They would consistently move from country to country and settle down in Syria. This was where my mother was born and lived until her early 20s, then moved to America. Anyway, when she was 8, and this was her aunt reciting the story to me, she went missing on the street when they were food shopping together. My grandmother scanned the street, yet couldn't find my mother. They rallied up all the men and staked the entire area out for a few hours, for about 5 hours, in a 3-mile span. Now, they live in the outskirts of the city, where to the north is where the rural area begins, and with rural areas come nomadic gypsies. They found my mother in that northern area, being shepherded around by an older gypsy woman, who had grabbed my mother in gypsy attire. Those colorful dresses, headbands, and her shoes were taken off and missing, and they even went far enough to rub dirt on her feet. They were using her for alms, to get handouts so people would empathize for a gypsy woman and her starving child. This is where it gets crazy. When they snatched her back, the lady raised an alarm, bringing in gypsy bros, who brawled with 3 of the men on the stakeout. They kicked ass, needless to say, and the gypsies went back to their camp or whatever. As they left, they turned to look back and see the gypsies horribly angry, horribly frightened. The lady who stole my mother was cursing up a storm, and they understood the language, which was Arabic, and apparently she was invoking some generations-old curse on them. They rubbed their crosses and kept moving. It was when they got my mother back when she started telling them stories of what they were preparing her for. My grandfather wasted no time and called in a priest, who exorcised and purified my mother again. Who seemed all right, but they didn't want to take any chances. It was when they finally sat her down to get her details when my aunt fainted. My mom, in childlike naivete, told them how the gypsy woman said to her that she was going to be part of the rebirth of their older, dead child. How by nightfall, my mother would be a boy, and they would continue their beautiful domestic life as lunatic freak gypsies. At this point, my grandfather was preparing to head back north to kick some more ass, when my mother went on. They caught up with the gypsies around early evening, when the sun was just about to set completely, and the night would take over in a span of half an hour or so. My mom said they showed her what they were preparing her for, and inside the caravan tent, at one corner, was some mock altar erected. At the center of this mock altar was a dug shallow pit, the center of which lay one long woven black silk. As the gypsy woman explained to my mom what would happen, my mother explained to my grandparents the shapes the silk was taking in the shallow pit. It appeared that conjoined kids were writhing under the silk, and she could hear the faint murmur of restless babies nearby. But looking at the silk, little arms and legs would form underneath the silk, and head shapes and limbs would be slinking throughout. Like a head shape would appear, then disappear, then 2 arms would stick out, then disappear. My grandparents were at a loss not at losing their oldest child, but what she almost got into. And in some crazy spin, they waited until daybreak the next day to approach the caravan and kick some more ass, but sadly what they came across was an abandoned ground.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.